encourage your soul, enlighten your mind, and empower your faith. This is the Light Network.
Welcome to Inside the Scholar Study, where we discuss all things concerning Scripture, faith, and scholarship. My name is Brad McNutt, and if you're ready, we're going to go inside the Scholar Study, and we're going to continue this season on textual criticism. And so I think we're headed to the end of the Bible today. We're going to the end and hanging a right.
Yeah, that's right. Let's go to Revelation 22:18. So this is the end of the Bible, the end of the New Testament, the end of the book of Revelation. This is what it says. There it is on the screen. What translation is that on the screen?
This is ESV, but I
Okay.
can quickly change it to, say, NRSV.
Okay. Is that what
There
it
we
is?
go.
Where does it say what translation it is?
Right here. Revised.
There it is. Okay. So
I
NRSV.
forget
I'm
you're
going to
an
read it out of
accordance
the.
user.
Yeah, right. That's right. What is this that we're looking at? Logos?
This is Logos.
Oh, okay. All
And
right.
with just the keystroke, I can go between countless translations.
Okay. Well, so we're in the NRSV right now. Okay. I'm going to read the NRSV because that's the Bible that's open in front of me here.
Okay.
This is verse 18. I warn everyone who hears the words of the prophecy of this book. If anyone adds to them, God will add to that person the plagues described in this book. If anyone, this is now verse 19, which is the verse we're going to concentrate more on. If anyone takes away from the words of the book of this prophecy, God will take away that person's share in the tree of life and in the holy city, which are described in this book. Okay, so a warning, don't change anything in the book of Revelation. You will be sorry if you do.
And
Similar. Yes,
they did.
right. And we're going to talk about it. Yeah, in fact, in this very passage, which is sort of ironic.
It is.
But the same kind of warning, probably some listeners will be familiar with. Where does it appear? Is it Deuteronomy 4:1-2? Is it at the beginning of Deuteronomy 4? I think that's right.
I think that's right.
Similar kind of warning. And then where else? It's Proverbs 30?
Yes, that sounds right. So yeah. Deuteronomy 4:2, and then I'm pretty sure Proverbs 30.
The other one?
I want to say like 5 and 6.
Okay, yeah. Maybe so.
Yep.
Did you get
Verse
it?
6. Do not add to his words, or else he will rebuke you, and you will be found a liar.
All right. Yeah, good job. Proverbs 30, verse 6. Okay, so back to Revelation 22:19. It's so sometimes I've heard preachers, and maybe you have too, or not just preachers, but I don't know, Bible students or something, talk about how this warning against changing the Word of God, it's in the beginning of the Bible, it's at the end of the Bible, and it's in the middle of the Bible. Deuteronomy, Proverbs, Revelation. So this warning, and we sometimes get it in other literature as well. But now we're still in the NRSV. Yeah, let's switch it to the New King James. How about that?
Let's see. Where is that on my standard list?
I mean, if you need to do the KJV, if that's easier to find, that's fine.
Well,
I thought we would be daring by going to the New King James.
There's the King James net. I assumed it would be a lot sooner than that. Let's go back.
Well,
you see how much better this is than Accordance?
Oh man, this is so nice. Yeah, I need to switch.
I'm just, pointing out. Well, I can't seem to find it at this current point. Let me open up a different tab and I will get it, I think. Actually, you know what? The New King James is so heretical, it's not even allowed on Logos. I forgot this.
It's not allowed on Logos. We will not have it.
But
What
we
about the
can go.
KJV? Does it have
The
the
King
KJV?
James is here. Let's get it.
Okay, all right. The authorized
Oh,
translation. That's what we.
yes.
Um, okay, so we need verse 19. Are we in 22?
22, verse 19.
All right. And if so, I'll read off the screen here. And if any man shall take away from the words of the book of this prophecy, God shall take away part out of the book of life and out of the holy city and from the things which are written in this book. So you listeners may have missed that, but let me read again from the New Revised Standard Version, NRSV. God will take away that person's share in the tree of life. The KJV says, God shall take away his part out of the book of life.
Mm.
So we got book of life in the KJV. In the NRSV, we've got tree of life.
My favorite part, though, about the King James, this right here. The end.
That's right.
Sorry.
Yeah, that was
Back at the
authorized.
ranch.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't have the end in my NRSV.
Mm-mm.
So yeah, I might just keep going. Okay, so the listeners can check this in their own translations, whatever translation you use, but I think this will be correct that the King James and the New King James both have book of life at Revelation 22:19, and basically every other translation is going to have tree of life. Certainly every 20th, 21st century translation other than the New King James is going to have tree of life. Let's just think about the implications of the reading briefly, and then we'll talk about how did it come about that we have these two different translations. So this is obviously a textual variant, and we'll look at this throughout the rest of this episode. What are the implications? Let's see. If you take away from the words of the book of this prophecy, God is going to take away your share in the book of life. Or what do you think that would mean? If we say he'll take away your share from the book of life, what do you think this warning is about, Brad?
Well, it kind of reminds me of several other warnings that are somewhat similar. Someone would be blotted out of the book of life or something along those lines.
Yeah.
So lose their soul, basically.
Soul, yeah. I mean, right. Yeah, it sounds like punishment to me. You're not going to enter into the presence of God or the new Jerusalem or the new heaven and new earth or heaven or however we want to think about the blessed state of the righteous in the next phase of existence. You won't be a part of it if you take away from the words of the book of this prophecy. You're not going to be in the book of life. Now, let's change it and say, the warning is actually God will take away that person's share in the tree of life. What do you think?
I mean, it's kind of a distinction, but really without a difference in my mind, anyway.
Yeah, I mean, both of them seem to mean either way. You're not going to go to heaven. Let's just put it in those terms. You're not going to go to heaven. It's like you're not going to have a life with God. Tree of life we see in Revelation. Is it Revelation 22 verse 2?
Yes.
On either side of the river is the tree of life. So it's there. This is the new heavens and new earth. It's in. So you want to be where the tree of life is. You want your name written in the book of life. In fact, you want both of these things. So if your name is going to be blotted out of the book of life, or your part in the book of life is going to be extinguished, or your part in the tree of life, both are bad. Look, I mean, the way I look at this is I am not going to lose sleep over this distinction. I would like to know the actual wording of every bit of the New Testament and every bit of the Bible. But but I am content with not having that level of specificity. As long as I can get the message that God intended for me to have, I feel pretty good about that. And I think that this difference is not a difference that obscures the message. What do you think about that, Brad? Is that good enough for
Yeah,
you as
yeah.
well?
I mean, like you say, I think we should, have to be committed to excellence and try our best. We want to make sure we've got exactly what God gave us. But at the end of the day, this is not an, a soul altering issue
Yeah.
at all. And
I
so
mean,
I'm not gonna worry about it.
like sometimes people, and there are people that get really really concerned about these sorts of things, or on the like, by which I mean conservative Christians. They go to church, they love the Bible, and they get very concerned about these sorts of differences. And then on the other hand, but similarly, there are what we might call opponents of Christianity
Mm.
that also highlight these sorts of differences and say you can't trust the Bible because you don't even know what the original wording is. You don't know what God is trying to tell you. Well, look, I mean, when I look at Revelation 22:19, okay, first of all, we're about to say, I'm pretty sure I know what the original wording is because this one is actually pretty easy. It's an interesting story how the difference came about. But when I look at Revelation 22:19, even if we could not make a final determination on the original wording, was it tree of life or was it book of life? I don't think that means I don't know what God was trying to tell me, even in this very verse, right? Because either one, I get the message that he is trying to reveal to people. So again, it just doesn't seem like that big of a deal if I can put it in those terms. All right, but how did it come about that you have these two different readings? It is sometimes said, it is sometimes said that the reading Book of Life appears in no Greek manuscript,
Mm.
which is not actually true, but it is true to say it does not appear in many Greek manuscripts. Definitely the majority of Greek manuscripts have the reading tree of life in Revelation 22:19, which is why the modern translations almost universally have that reading. Um, and the King James and the New King James are the ones that have Book of Life, which corresponds to very few manuscripts. How did it come about that book got in the text? You can see on the screen here. Here's Tree of Life, Xulu Teszoes. Um, how did it come about that book got in the text? Here's the answer to the question: Erasmus.
Mm.
I think we've talked about Erasmus before. Have we talked about him?
A little, probably, at some
Okay,
point.
he is the guy about 500 years ago he is the first guy who published a printed Greek New Testament. So the year was 1516, and um, printing had been around for about 60-65 years by that point, but nobody had published a printed Greek New Testament. No, printing had been around. People had been printing Bibles, but those Bibles were in Latin or even in Hebrew. Jews and some Christians were printing Hebrew Bibles. They just hadn't bothered to print the Greek New Testament until the early 1500s. And then you had these two projects go along simultaneously
Mm.
in the 15 teens. Um, one of them is Erasmus's Greek New Testament that was published in 1516. And then the other one is this bigger work called the Complutensian Polyglot. It's poly it's called Complutensian because that's the name of the city where it was printed. It's Alcala, Spain, but the Latin designation of Alcala, this is outside of Madrid. The Latin designation is complutum. And so the Bible was called the Complutensian polyglot. It's called polyglot because it has multiple languages. It's not just the Greek New Testament. It's multiple languages. And really the star of the show in the Complutensian polyglot, according to the editors, was the Latin Vulgate. And in the Old Testament, they had the Latin Vulgate in the middle with the Hebrew text on one side and the Septuagint on the other side. So polyglot, several languages involved. They also had Aramaic, the Targumim represented on the page, at least for the Pentateuch, and maybe some other commentary. And in the New Testament, they had it was just the Vulgate and the Greek New Testament. All right, so that one was simultaneous with Erasmus. Actually, the New Testament part of that was printed a little bit before Erasmus's work was printed. The New Testament portion of the Complutensian Polyglot was printed in 1514, but it was not published, I think, until 1522. Okay, so Erasmus got the credit for being the first person to publish a printed Greek New Testament. Not the first person to print a Greek New Testament, but to publish a printed Greek New Testament. 1516. Now, he didn't have a whole lot of manuscripts. Erasmus didn't. And in fact, he only had one manuscript for the book of Revelation. I think actually this is where I can share my screen, Brad. Do I just click on that share screen button?
You should be able to.
Let's see if this works. Okay, we don't want to go there yet. I'll talk about some of these pictures sometime, but I guess you can see this, Brad?
I'm working on getting it assigned to
sharing this tab. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, when
okay. Well, maybe not so much. Okay, I can see the PowerPoint, but I can't see you.
had one manuscript for the book of Revelation. Let me go. Let's see. Let me just fast forward through these pictures.
Well, for some reason, I can't get them to cooperate, and that's
oh, okay.
a little agitating, but we'll get it worked out.
Okay, but you can see like Erasmus 1516, end of Revelation.
I can't right now. There's something with the way this is overlaid, and I can't.
You can't do it.
I am afraid at this current moment that if I... Let's see.
Well, I mean, I can talk about it, so that's
okay.
All right.
Yeah, go ahead, and I will keep playing and see if I can get it pulled up here.
Okay. So Erasmus only had one Greek manuscript, and for the book of Revelation, he had, I don't know, three. We'll probably talk about Erasmus and his New Testament at more length at some point, but he had three or four, I think three for the Gospels, and maybe a few for Paul's letters. For the book of Revelation, he had one manuscript. It was a manuscript that was a commentary. So, think about going to the library and getting a commentary off the shelf, a commentary that also supplies the translation of the book. So let's say it's a commentary on the book of Revelation. And you could text of Revelation. It's maybe not the most convenient way to read the book of Revelation. But if you didn't have any other copy of the book of Revelation, all you had was this commentary, well, okay, you can get the text of Revelation in there. So this is The one manuscript of Revelation Erasmus had was a commentary. It was a commentary by this guy named Andrew of Caesarea from about 1,000 years earlier. The manuscript wasn't 1,000 years old. The manuscript was much more recent than that. But the commentary was originally written back 1,000 years earlier. And so one of the things Erasmus had to do was figure out, because the commentary manuscript, it would cite the text of Revelation, and then it would give commentary from Andrew of Caesarea, and then you would have the text of Revelation again, and then the commentary would come. And so one of the things Erasmus had to do was make sure that he was not putting in the text the bit into the text of Revelation what was actually commentary from Andrew of Caesarea. He had to separate out the text of Revelation from the commentary. But then the bigger problem for what we're talking about right now, the end of Revelation, the bigger problem is that his one manuscript of Revelation, did not contain the ending of Revelation. It just, that is like, originally, surely it did have the entirety of the commentary, but then the last few pages were just off the manuscript. They had been lost. And so the text of Revelation in the manuscript that Erasmus had came to an end at Revelation 22, verse 16. And Erasmus didn't have in Greek any of the rest. He did have it in Latin, of course, because he had the Latin Vulgate. He had plenty of manuscripts. He knew that there was supposed to be more to it. It broke off in the middle of this verse. He just didn't have it in Greek. So what does he do? He translates it into Greek from Latin. And at one point that we're talking, I mean, they're in doing that, in translating the last 6 verses of Revelation from Latin into Greek. That's what I meant. Maybe I said it the opposite. He translated it from the Vulgate into Greek to fill out the rest of the Greek New Testament. In translating those last 6 verses, I think he introduced all sorts of readings that are unattested in other Greek manuscripts, but one of them is this one that we're talking about. Is it Book of Life or is it Tree of Life? And we can see, well, if you can see the screen, if you could, I'm looking at, on my screen anyway, I'm looking at the text of Erasmus's edition, and he also, just like the Complutensian Polyglot, Erasmus has the Greek on one side and Latin on the other. And in both of them, he has the phrase Book of Life. So in Greek and then also in Latin, Book of Life. Just about everyone who studies this is convinced that the original reading was Tree of Life in Greek. And that was translated, this is going to get a little complicated, but that was translated into Latin, Tree of Life, with the Latin word, let me pronounce it this way, lignus. And indeed, so our earliest Latin manuscripts do have that word, Tree of Life, lignus. But the Latin word for book is liber. And eventually our Latin manuscripts, not the earliest Latin manuscripts, but later Latin manuscripts, we start to see the phrase Book of Life rather than Tree of Life. Lignus has now become liber. And you can sort of hear that, how those are similar sounding and similar looking words. And you can imagine how in Latin it might go a scribe. I mean, let me say, both of those phrases, Book of Life, Tree of Life, are good biblical phrases. They both sort of make sense. But you can imagine how a scribe might see lignus vitae and write down liber vitae in Latin. let me in Greek, the difference is much more stark. So xulon is the Greek word for tree, and biblon or biblos or biblion is the Greek word for book. Um, and so, they're nothing alike. But in Latin, they're pretty close. And so, what has happened almost certainly is that the Greek New Testament, the Greek text of Revelation, was translated accurately into Latin. But then along the way, the transmission of the Latin text became corrupt because scribes, whatever, missed it or changed it for some reason, so that Tree of Life became Book of Life in Latin. And then Erasmus, who did not have a complete Greek manuscript, had to rely on the Vulgate, which by that time had the phrase Book of Life, and he translated that into Greek, and thereby almost introduced a reading that had never been found in Greek manuscripts before, or is represented in very few Greek manuscripts. I have a record here in my notes. It shows that there are, in fact, 4 manuscripts out of the hundreds of, well, honestly, I don't know exactly how many copies of the book of Revelation that we have that also preserve the ending of the book of Revelation. I know that we have hundreds of manuscripts of the book of Revelation, but how many of those manuscripts are complete, or how many of those manuscripts preserve the ending, I'm not sure, but let's say dozens of manuscripts. Out of those, I know about 4 that have the reading Book of Life, like the KJV. Let me tell you what those 4 are. And I'm going to give you numbers that correspond to the manuscripts. So, have we talked about this before? That Greek manuscripts are assigned particular numbers by the INTF. I think we have talked about the INTF before, the Institute for Neue Testamentliche Wissenschaft, or Forschung, excuse me, INTF. Um, and they collect the manuscripts, they assign numbers to them. So the numbers according to the INTF. So this is manuscript 2049 has the reading uh, Book of Life, but listen, it's a 16th century manuscript, and we happen to know that it is a copy of a printed edition. So it has no value for the original text, because in my notes I've got that it was probably copied from Erasmus's edition.
Exactly.
All right. So then we also have manuscript 296, 296, but that also is a 16th century manuscript and was also a copy of a printed edition. This time it's the 1534 edition, Bocolinnaeus. All right, so again, no value there as an independent witness to the text of Revelation. But there are 2 manuscripts that probably are independent of printed editions, or are likely independent of that. So this is manuscript 2007, 2067. It's a 15th century manuscript. It has the phrase Book of Life in the margin. In the margin. This is I'm going to read from a scholar named Jan Kranz. Often marginal annotations were entered into manuscripts long after they were written, mostly by someone who was collating its text with another source. Chances are high that these marginal notes derive from a printed edition. So here again, even though we have a 15th century manuscript, which was definitely before Erasmus, because he was 16th century. So we have a 15th century manuscript, but the reading Book of Life is not in the original text of the manuscript. It's in the margin of the manuscript. And according to Kranz, the likelihood is that somebody was actually looking at a printed edition and wrote it in the margin. So again, doesn't have a whole lot of value there. And then the final manuscript is actually a pretty famous manuscript, but it also is very late, 16th century. It is manuscript 61. It is famous enough to have a name, and so it is Codex Montfortianus. And what has happened with that one is that this is let me see. This is a manuscript that um, has a correction in it, but the original text has the word book of life. Now, it is a manuscript that is well known for having many readings taken from the Vulgate. So, I mean, that's probably what happened here, is that this 16th century manuscript, even if it wasn't copied from Erasmus or it wasn't copied from some other printed edition, it probably was comparing the Greek text to the Latin Vulgate, and that's how it got its reading. So it seems to me that this Codex Montfortianus, which we will probably talk about in a future episode, because it also has another very famous reading, which is called the Johannine Comma. That if listeners don't exactly know what that is, you could get on Wikipedia to see what it is, but we'll talk about it at some point. But this manuscript 61 that does have the phrase "Book of Life" at Revelation 22:19 is, again, very late and probably corrected according to the Vulgate. Now, there are people who think that the King James Version is the best translation, or it's the most authoritative translation, or it's the translation that everybody ought to be using, and more modern translations, they pervert or corrupt or offer a corrupted form of the Word of God. And so some of them will even defend this reading here in Revelation 22:19 and say, no, like the King James Version does provide us with the best text here. Even though it corresponds to very few Greek manuscripts, it is the best. And I guess, if you want to make that sort of argument, I guess you can. But I will say that Erasmus himself admits his procedure, and there are a few passages where, let's see, this is in his annotations. This is by Erasmus in 1516 in the annotations that were that's sort of like the study Bible part of the Bible. So he published the Greek New Testament with his Latin translation alongside it, and then he published like notes. And he says in those notes, however, at the end of this book, I found some words in our versions. Our versions would be the Latin versions, because he's writing in Latin. However, at the end of this book, the book of Revelation, I found some words in our versions which were lacking in the Greek copies. And then he says, but we added them from the Latin. So he says it. He says it again. This is in 1520. This is in his response to the annotations of Edward Lee. This is a little bit longer paragraph. He says, there was no doubt that the words had been omitted, and they were only a few. Okay, so he's talking about the end of Revelation in his manuscript. He knew that he had some words that were left out, that it didn't go all the way to the end. He says, to avoid leaving a lacuna in my text, I supplied the Greek out of our Latin version. I did not want to conceal this from the reader, however, and admitted in the annotations what I had done. And of course, we just read that. He did admit it. My thought was that the reader, if he had access to a manuscript, could correct anything in our words that differed from those put by the author of this work. And yet I would not have dared to do in the Gospels or even in the apostolic epistles what I have done here. That's interesting, isn't it? That Erasmus seems to have a little bit less concern about the exact wording in the book of Revelation as opposed to the Gospels and the epistles. He says the language of this book is very simple and the content has mostly a historical sense, not to mention that the authorship was once uncertain. Finally, this passage is merely the conclusion of the work. All right, and then one more time, Erasmus talks about what he did at the end of Revelation. This is in another uh, uh, work directed at this guy named Edward Lee. Erasmus says, and this one was also written in 1520. He says, at the end of the apocalypse, the manuscript I used, I had only one, for the book is rarely found in Greek. The manuscript I used was lacking one or two lines. I added them following the Latin codices. They were of the kind that could be restored out of the preceding text. Thus, when I sent the revised copy to Basel, that's where the printing of Erasmus's Greek New Testament happened in Switzerland, I wrote to my friends to restore the place out of the Aldine edition. I'll come back to that in a second. Let me finish Erasmus here. For I had not yet bought that work. They did as I instructed them. So he says that they checked it out of the Aldine edition. This is a 1518 printing of the Greek New Testament. So Erasmus printed the Greek New Testament in 1516, and then he did a second edition in 1519. And in between those two editions, eventually Erasmus did 5 editions, the last one in 1535. But in between the first 2 editions, this other group of people published one, and it's called the Aldine edition in 1518. And Erasmus said to his printers, why don't you check the Aldine edition and see what they have at the end of Revelation so that you can correct mine, because all I did was translate it out of Latin, and they probably had a Greek manuscript that they were using, and you can correct it based on their text. And so that's what they did. But Erasmus did not realize that the Aldine edition was just a copy of Erasmus's own edition. So it didn't do any good to correct it based on the Aldine edition. So anyway, that is how the phrase "book of life" got, first of all, in the 1516 first published printed Greek New Testament of Erasmus, because he translated it himself out of the Latin Vulgate, out of a late form of the Latin Vulgate, and then from there it became a part of what is called the Textus Receptus, or the received text of the Greek New Testament, the text that eventually was translated by the King James Version, and then that became sort of the standard text in English for, a few hundred years. But it actually appears in hardly any Greek manuscripts at all, and really hardly any before Erasmus himself. They're all the Greek manuscripts that we see are basically 16th century manuscripts, and there's just 4 of them that have it.
All right.
Yeah. Well,
Anything else?
no, I think that covers that story anyway.
Yes. And, it reminds me that even within the last few months, there is a church in our area who, well, let me reverse. I'm not sure that the church is doing that. Several members in that church, and I have been told that the church's position is that the King James is the best translation. And so they've kind of started, some of the members have been sharing things on social media about how modern versions are dangerous because they delete passages that are in the King James and change the wording, which is what we're talking about here. And so it's funny how it all comes back up again, and how we have to knowing exactly how to navigate and thread that needle and help people, and at the same time also knowing when to engage and when not to.
Right.
And being equipped to at least know what's under discussion, what somebody may be missing or may not be understanding. So when we were having that discussion, I could just see those posts in my head and thinking, okay, now I can tell people, hey, just come watch this episode. Just come watch this episode.
Well, I mean, I am fully confident you can obey God through the King James Version. You know, if
Absolutely.
that's your Bible, that's no problem at all. I don't see how you wouldn't be able to obey God or know the truth or whatever from the ESV or the NIV or the NRSV, like particularly on a passage like this. But I mean, I know people when they start arguing, they'll bring up the bigger deals, and we'll talk about them at some point. You know, the end of Mark and John 8, maybe Acts 8:37, some other passages along those lines that we will eventually talk about in this season. But I mean, even in those cases, I'm not sure what is at stake.
Right.
In terms of the truth of the gospel or something like that. And maybe I'm just missing something. I mean, maybe what's at stake is just the something about the word of God itself for people. Like if we
I feel like
can't,
that's what a lot of people
like
are.
it all falls apart if we don't.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I don't know exactly how their understanding of inspiration and even transmission works.
Yeah.
If they believe that inspiration even involves God supernaturally taking over all of the manuscripts and different things, I would be very interested to see, to kind of probe into that and see what it is that they're
Yeah.
just how they think about it. Not even to argue or disagree. Just explain to me where you're coming from so I can
Yeah.
understand that better. So, but anyway, what we're talking about this season is addressing all those things, and so it will prove to be helpful. Anything else you want to add before we are done?
No, that'll do it for this time.
All right. Well, you can email us at scholars@thelightnetwork.tv. We want to remind you, episodes release each and every Wednesday in podcasting platforms, our website at thelightnetwork.tv, YouTube, all over the place. You can search us and you can find us. And as we've said this season, when we're adding video for multiple reasons, but especially for the content of this season, the video version is probably going to be much more advantageous to you as we're looking at the manuscripts themselves sometimes, and then the text and different works that may not be easily accessible to you. I don't know how many people own a Greek New Testament in their home. I mean, had I not been to school, I probably wouldn't have one either. Anyway, those resources are available to you if you want to go back and look at them there as well. But we're grateful that you were with us today and hope that you'll be with us again next week as we go back inside the Scholar's Study.